Thank you very much for having me today. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share with you a journey across Europe, which actually includes Spain as well, as you will see, to address the question of the role of heavy cannabis use in the incidence of psychotic disorder. It's sad because I was looking forward to be in Madrid with you all today. Hopefully this will happen soon in the future. At least we are safe from our own households with the COVID situation. So before getting into the new data, I just want to take you over some of the consolidated evidence that describe the link between cannabis use and psychotic disorder. You be aware that there have now been at least 3 meta-analyses that have pointed at cannabis use as a risk factor for psychotic disorder. But the latest one, published in 2015, indicated that it's not only important to look at the role of cannabis in general, but it's actually the amount of cannabis that is consumed that has really the greatest impact. And this meta-analysis by Marconi and Vassus indicates how, with the increase on the x-axis of the amount of cannabis reported by each of these studies, each line represents one of the study in the meta-analysis, you have an increase in the odds ratio for psychotic disorder that you have on the y-axis, with a pooled odds ratio which reaches 4. This is very important because the previous meta-analysis had only based the data looking at the link between cannabis and psychosis on asking people, have you ever used cannabis, yes or no? They reported an overall increase in the risk of developing psychotic disorder around 2. But as you can see, when you begin to ask about amount of consumption of cannabis, you are actually estimating an impact which has a 4-fold increase in the probability to suffer from a psychotic disorder compared to people who have never used cannabis. And this is something important to bear in mind. So I work as a clinician in a unit who looks after young people who have developed the first episode of psychosis for the first time. And sadly, 2/3 of them have actually used cannabis before the onset of the illness. And it's in my interaction with them that really the first question that I'm going to share with you has developed. And the question is, who actually are the cannabis users at risk of developing psychotic disorder? Because we do know that not all the cannabis users develop psychosis. And one of the questions I get from my patients is, well, you think cannabis has played a role in my illness, but what about my friends who are out there and they're still using cannabis and clearly they're not coming to the clinic? And so one possibility is the different way people use cannabis. And in this picture from UK, where you can see Shakespeare having a joint, I like to give a hint on perhaps the importance of the amount. So the amount you have in your joint, and we will see later on perhaps how often you smoke, but indeed what's actually it's inside the joint, the type of cannabis that people use. And the other question is more a question that comes from my academic peers, which is, well, if cannabis use is really a risk for psychotic disorder, shouldn't have we seen an increase in the incidence rates of the illness in places where cannabis use is prevalent? And I will take you through data that we have used to try and address both questions. First of all, I want to start from London. London is the place where I work both as a clinician and as an academic. And it's always polite when you talk about something or somebody to introduce them. So I'm going to introduce you the cannabis I deal with in London. Not deal sounds a bit ambiguous, not as a dealer, but obviously as an academic. So when you think about London and its cannabis, you have really the cannabis sativa plant, which can present to people that use it in this way. And this is what we call imported herbal or traditional weed. Then we have this, and you don't need to be a botanicist to pick up the difference between these two types of cannabis. They look very differently, and they feel very differently, and they smell very differently. And this is the reason why the type of cannabis on your right is actually called skunk. And skunk is the female plant with no seeds, as crops are grown not pollinated. And the actual other name is sensimilla, which indicates exactly the plant without seeds. And because it's not been pollinated, he has put all his energy in producing the cannabinoids, which are very rich in this fluorescence that you can see. And it's called skunk because this enrichment in cannabinoids and terpenoids gives a very unique, strong smell. And the little animal in English is called skunk, which also has got a very strong smell. But another type of cannabis you get is this that comes in 2 soap bars, and these days also in pellets, which actually mostly comes from Morocco by Spain, and is what we know as resin or hashish. And these 3 types of cannabis also have a very different proportion of 2 of cannabis' main active ingredients: THC, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, that we have seen even until recently maintains on average a percentage of THC around 16%, and virtually no cannabidiol or CBD. Imported herbal would have a THC around 5 to 6%, and again, practically no CBD. And hashish, or the resin, is quite interesting because until recently you had the 4 to 5% content of THC, like imported herbal, but also an equal amount of CBD, and we'll see why this might be relevant. And these are data that are valid until around 2015, but more recent data from 2018 have indicated that actually resin and hashish have significantly changed. And now in resin and hashish, we find up to 18% of THC, like in skunk. And again, CBD is disappearing from this type of cannabis as well. But if we stick to this picture and this data for a moment, this will help you to understand what I'm about to share with you. And so here we have data where the question is, does cannabis type actually matter in South London? So why should I bore you with the type of cannabis that you can find in the street of South London where I work? Well, we collected data on cannabis use and pattern of cannabis use from a large sample of first episode psychosis patients coming to our hospital catchment area, and to an equal number of population controls coming from the same catchment area who would have become cases if they had developed psychosis. So these are not friends and family of the academics taking part in the study, but they are people that are meant to represent the general population for the main social demographic. So when we compared the data on pattern of cannabis use between cases and controls and took into account several other confounders, what we saw was that when we combined the type of cannabis that people reported using with the frequency of their use, we found that those who reported using every day skunk type cannabis had over a 5-fold increase in the probability to suffer from a psychotic disorder. The odds ratio for psychotic disorder, they were over 5. Those who use skunk at weekends also had a significant increase in the odds ratio for psychotic disorder. When you actually look carefully at this graph, you can see that using hashish, the hashish I've just described, the one with a 1 ratio between THC and CBD, didn't seem to have a significant increase in the probability of suffering from a psychotic disorder when compared to the reference group, which is those who never use cannabis. When people see this graph, they get quite excited and they ask me, oh, well, it looks actually like having hashish at the weekends is protective for psychosis. But this is not true. It's actually not statistically significant. And what it's just telling you is that using the hashish with a 1-to-1 ratio between THC and CBD, either once per week or weekends, does not impact on your odds ratio for psychotic disorder. A very different story for the skunk group of users. This was a very important message for public education, and we hoped that young people who are the more likely to use cannabis in London did take notice. But there was one British citizen that indeed took notice of our data, and this is our Queen. And now when our Queen receives cannabis as a present, she very carefully smells it to triage it in case it is skunk and not have it for tea. But also we wanted to look at the impact of this data at a population level. And what we found was estimated something called the population attributable fraction, that if skunk use was actually abolished from South London, we could have prevented 24 new cases of psychotic disorder to come to the attention of mental health services. And for those of you that, like me, are a clinician, 24% less cases of psychosis is a significant reduction in the number of cases we see. And this is exactly the geographical area where I work. So for me to see 24% less cases of psychosis would have a huge impact on my case log and the work of my clinical team, let alone on the family of the patients and of course the society as a whole. But this is London. What happens when we leave our parochial sort of South London data and we moved in Europe? And the study I'm going to share with you is a study that was set before breakfast, so it's very dear to my heart. But let's see what's happening actually in UK at the time of the transition between being part of the EU and leaving the EU. So this is a picture from a Metropolitan Police conference, and it's actually showing an indoor plantation of cannabis meant to make skunk available. And this is a couple, a classic British couple having a cup of tea and looking at the neighbor's window, wondering why on earth do they always have the light on? And they're also puzzled by the fact that when it's snowing, if they look at the roof of the neighbors, the roof has got no snow. And the reason is very simple. The neighbors are actually growing cannabis in their flat, and therefore the strong lights that you need for an indoor hydroponic plantation are generating heat that is also preventing from the snow settling on the roof. And in UK, you can find easily on the web this kind of manual and indeed develop your indoor cannabis plantation. So one hope that we have for the economy is that skunk made in England might save us from the UK financial crisis that we expect to hit us. But forget about Brexit and go back to the happy period of collaboration with Europe, where this study, the UGI study, was set. And as you can see, it spans across several sites in Europe that also include several in Spain, including Madrid and Barcelona. And of course, UK, like the place where I work in South London. And again, this was a first episode psychosis study, which actually aimed to recruit incident studies. So all the first episodes that within the time frame of the study presented in specific hospital catchment area. And again, population control, truly representing the general population of where the cases came from. And we collected in details data again on cannabis use, but also we'll see later DNA. And these are the sites and the sites that I will include in the cannabis analysis because they were the one that were able to collect reliable data on cannabis consumption. So you heard about the type of cannabis available in London, but it becomes much more complicated when you want to make sense on what is available across Europe, and more importantly, what is the potency? So what is the concentration of THC and CBD that you expect in the type of cannabis that people report using across Europe? So first of all, I had to update the data that we had from the previous potency study. And so this is me with some of my students and colleagues from the lab trying to analyze 350 samples of cannabis seized by the Metropolitan Police in South London. And interestingly enough, 94% of them turned out to be of skunk type. I actually was very worried because I had to carry this huge suitcase in the London Underground. And believe me, it did smell very strongly of cannabis. Luckily, I didn't meet any Metropolitan Police dogs, and I made it to the lab safely. And the data that we reported were included in our analysis, but also I had to make sense of what was going on across Europe. And luckily, the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction in 2016 published a report looking at data across Europe on the type of cannabis and the potency that you would expect in Spain, in France, in Italy. And very interesting in the Netherlands. The Netherlands actually every year publishes its own report on the percentage of THC and CBD expected to be found in the coffee shop. And to give you an idea of what you can find, or you could find a list in around 2016, which is in the middle of the time when we were recruiting our participant, you can see type of cannabis like nether ash going up to on average 29% of THC and having potentially a maximum THC of 67%. So in the Netherlands, we would have expected out of all the sites of our study to have the highest concentration of THC in the type of cannabis available. And so based on the data from experimental studies, we decided to set up a threshold of 10% of THC, and we decided that any type of cannabis that we knew was expected to have less than THC was going to be considered in the low potency category. Anything with equal or more than 10% of THC would be considered in the high potency category. And you would be interested to know that at the time of the study, those who use hashish would be in the low potency category, when type of cannabis imported from Morocco, like sensimilla, would be in the high potency category, according to the data from the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drugs Addiction. So now we get into the data. So we use the similar approach as from the London study. We created a combined measure of frequency and type to estimate amount of cannabis used across the whole sample. And this is the data, which is quite interesting. You can see it reproduces the same sort of linear increase in odds ratio when you go from the reference point of 1 never users across those who use with different frequency, low potency cannabis, to reach the group at your extreme right of daily use of THC equal or above 10%, so high potency type of cannabis. And if you focus initially on the green bar gives you an odds ratio for daily use of high potency, which is almost 6. And this is what we would call pretty much a crude odds ratio, where I've only adjusted for age, gender, and ethnicity. When I actually adjust for much more, and I include adjusting for level of education, employment status, other drugs, and drugs which we know are associated with risk of psychosis, the odds ratio drops, but it remains around 5, as for the London data. So we have a consistent 5-fold increase in the odds ratio to develop a psychotic disorder for those who use high potency cannabis daily. And this was quite reassuring because it made our cannabis data from London generalizable beyond the English Channel. What if we look at specific cities, and we look at these 3 cities, and you'll see later why. And what we found was that when we look at the same measure of potency and frequency in London, Amsterdam, and in Paris, you can see that the odds ratio for a psychotic disorder in the daily users of high potency in London is comparable to the previous data from UK. But when you look at Amsterdam, those who use high potency every day have an odds ratio of 9, which is a remarkable odds ratio, heavily adjusted as well, compared to odds ratio of other risk factors for psychotic disorder. And this indicates how when you look at a high potency group in Amsterdam, you really look at people who are probably exposed to a much higher concentration of THC than the one even in London or in Paris for the same group of high potency users. But why should potency matter so much? Why the concentration of THC should make such a difference? Well, we know in London that using high potency cannabis has had a huge impact on the ability of having sensible ideas in our politician. This is a cartoon from the Times that suggests that perhaps the idea of going on with Brexit and even to consider a no-deal Brexit was induced by some of the politicians having actually used skunk, and perhaps this is the case across the world, even in America right now. But anyway, let's stick to the science. We know that the plant, the cannabis sativa, can produce high concentration only to 1 at a time of THC and CBD. And THC and CBD are the 2 most studied cannabinoid, by all means not the only 2. THC has been very clearly and well associated in experimental studies to the onset of psychotic symptoms and also of cognitive impairment, when cannabidiol has not been associated to psychotic symptoms or impairment in cognition. On the contrary, the presence of CBD and THC together in experimental studies has shown that CBD is able to ameliorate the ability of THC to induce psychosis. So when you have a type of cannabis which has both THC and CBD together with a ratio 1, you might expect a very different effect and impact on psychosis of a type of cannabis with solo high concentration of THC. I apologize, you'll be hearing my dog in the background. This is what happens when in COVID times we do recording from home. So I'm sorry about this. She knows lots about cannabis because she has been listening to me talking about it for a long time. She's also a Labrador, so I'm sure she could smell it if I came home with a cannabis sample. But going back to the presentation, this is also a study that shows how the type of cannabis is not only relevant and important to estimate individual risk to develop psychosis, but also has an important impact for those people who, after having had an onset of psychosis, continue their cannabis use. And again, the frequency and type of cannabis has a significant impact on the clinical and functional outcome of these young people. Those who use high potency and those who use it on daily basis are much more likely, up to threefold increase, to relapse, to be readmitted to hospital, to have longer hospital admission, and to be admitted in intensive care, which, as we know as clinicians, has significant impact on the individual chances to recover, or the length of period they will need to recover. And again, this is a modifiable risk factor that as clinicians we should bear in mind when we think about what has an effect on the outcome of the people that we take care of. But moving on to the other question, the one of the impact at a population level. So is there a relationship between prevalence of cannabis use in the population and the incidence rate of psychosis? We were very lucky to be able to address this question in the UGI study, because the UGI study published data which actually did look at the variation of the incidence of psychotic disorder across the sites that took part in the study. And here I'm only presenting the sites which I've included in the cannabis analysis because I'm the one where I had reliable cannabis data. And you can see how across these 11 sites, you have quite significant up and down in the incidence rate for psychosis per 100,000 per person a year, which is how you measure incidence rates. And these incidence rates are already adjusted for age, gender, and minority status, which are 3 factors that we know can have a contribution on variation of incidence geographically. But this up and downs is still significant and shows a 4-fold variation across the sites. So let's see if we can use the data that we have from the UGI to understand what might be the contribution of the use of high potency and of daily use across Europe. So in these slides, you see the same green line, which indicates the up and down of the incidence rates. And in green, you have the prevalence of daily cannabis use in the population controls. And as I mentioned before, the population controls represent the local population. So this prevalence of daily cannabis use is really an estimate of what we expect to be the prevalence of daily use in the population of these sites. And as you can see, the 2 lines go very nicely up and down together, with a very significant correlation index of 0.8, which is a very high index of correlation, which is also significant to indicate that the amount and so the daily consumption of cannabis use in the general population seems to contribute to the number of cases that we expect to present across these different sites. What about high potency? We did the same for our, for daily use. You can see that, as you expect, the 2 places which have high prevalence of daily cannabis use in the population, are also 2 of the 3 with the highest incidence rates. What about high potency? So again, in green, you have in red, you have the up and down of the incidence rates that you're familiar with. And this time in green, you have the prevalence of high potency cannabis use in the population controls. So how much high potency the population of each site is consuming. And again, you can see that the 2 peaks, as we would expect, are given by London and Amsterdam, where we know at the time of the study they were the most potent type of cannabis available across Europe. Again, this is a very strong and significant correlation. What if we look again at how this translates in terms of population attributable fraction? And here I'm going to pause for a second. Population attributable fraction is really measure the proportion of new cases in a specific geographical area that can be attributed to a risk factors for which a causal link with the illness has been supported. So it's not meant to indicate causality or prove causality, but give you an estimate of, So now I would like to go back to what can we tell when we measure the population attributable fraction across the European sites of this study. So first of all, I would like to pause and remind everybody that the population attributable fraction is not meant to prove causality. It's a measure based on the assumption that the risk factors that we're looking at has a causal link with the disorder, in this case with psychosis, and it uses adjusted odds ratio for the risk factor and the prevalence of the risk factors both in the clinical group and in the controls. Here, to make it easier, I'll just show the one in the clinical group, so in the first episode psychosis. And again, the population attributable fraction is not saying that the cases of psychosis, in this case, attributable to, for instance, high potency cannabis, are all related to that. But he's saying that if we could have abolished the contribution of high potency cannabis on the number of new cases that we expect, for instance, in London, 30% of them could have been prevented if high potency cannabis use had been abolished. So for this 30%, high potency has represented the risk factors, the causal risk factors that has tipped them over the threshold. It doesn't mean that they didn't have other risk factors. Amsterdam, the same. I remember the colleague from Amsterdam, when they, or other colleague actually, not the one of the study, when they saw this, they actually sent a letter to the Lancet saying it is not possible to believe the 50% cases of psychosis in London are just to do with high potency cannabis use. And this is not what the population attributable fraction is saying, but he's saying that for 50% of new cases of psychosis, if high potency cannabis use had been abolished or had not been present, these 50% of cases would have not developed a psychotic disorder. And so it's a very important message for prevention. And here you have the data for Madrid, where at the time the type of cannabis was not very potent, and actually its use was not very prevalent. Here you have also the data from Barcelona, and I wanted to show the data for Palermo. Palermo is actually the city where I was born and where I studied medicine. Palermo is useless, or was useful at the time, for high potency. You can see it gives an odds ratio of 0.6, which doesn't mean that Palermo high potency is good for psychosis, but it means that the only one that had tried actually high potency were 4 controls who had gone on holiday in Amsterdam, and they had tried to a high potency cannabis. So we could not really estimate the population attributable fraction. And of course, the 2-1 with the highest population attributable fraction, as already mentioned, are the one where we know we have more high potency cannabis. But of course, when this paper came out, we had to face some fierce criticism, which is understandable in the scientific community. So the first one was, could this be all explained by schizophrenia genes, meaning that the people who are more likely to use cannabis daily and indeed to choose high potency cannabis perhaps are people who have schizophrenia genes, and they are more predisposed to use the cannabis in this way, and they are anyway already on the trajectory to develop a psychotic disorder. Well, we looked into that because, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we had genetic data from the UGI. And what we did was we summarized the GWAS, the genome-wide association data from the old sample into a polygenic risk score, really a sort of genetic summary of individual risk for psychosis. And we use it to see if, when we compare the never users, these are data just from the control, so psychosis doesn't come into the picture. When we compare the population control in terms of never users with those who have had used cannabis at some point, and we look on average at the genetic load for psychosis, as you can see, there's no significant difference between the one that used cannabis at some point in their life with the one that never use it. Same for the one that choose to use cannabis daily. That is, they don't have more genes for psychosis than the one that never use. And indeed, when you look at those who use high potency compared to the one that never use, and also when we look at people who might have started using quite early in adolescence, because there's some indication that perhaps the one they use very early, they have already experiencing some symptoms of psychosis, and they're seeking to self-medicate. And this is not what these data are suggesting, at least not in our sample. But also some studies using mostly Mendelian randomization, which have suggested again that there is a schizophrenia genetic predisposition that is explaining why people use cannabis, and therefore this is explaining the association between the two. So what we did is that we rerun some of our analysis, controlling, adjusting for the contribution of genes for schizophrenia, again using the schizophrenia polygenic risk score. And in this graph, you can see that when on the overall sample, we adjusted for schizophrenia polygenic score for the category that we know carry the highest risk, such as weekly use of high potency and daily use of high potency, we still see a significant increase in the odds ratio for psychotic disorder, even when we adjust for genes for schizophrenia. But also what I wanted to see was what happens if you have both. What happens if you have lots of genes for schizophrenia and indeed you are using cannabis heavily? And this graph is showing that when you see an increase in the schizophrenia genetic load, which is the x-axis, for each pattern of cannabis use, so either that you are using not at all or that you are using little or on average or a lot, you have a steadily increase in your probability to suffer from a psychotic disorder. And the group that is leading, having the higher risk all along, is the one for the daily use of high potency cannabis. These two risk factors independently affect the risk for psychotic disorder, but when you combine them together, of course, you have something that goes in the direction of an additive effect, although there is not a statistically significant additive interaction. But the bottom line is, as we know for the rest of medicine, that if you have hypertension and you are obese, your chances of myocardial infarct are worse than if you have only one of the two risk factors. So what I would like to do now with you is to show you how questions that have been inspired mostly in my interaction with my patients, so from the bed, the clinical environment, have been translated and tested into a research context, but also how it is important when we learn something in the bench, in the academic environment, we shouldn't forget to bring it back to the bed, to where we look after our clinical patients. And so based on these data, and on the fact that I do work in one of the geographical area that I've been describing, where there is lots of high potency cannabis use and indeed daily use of high potency, I wanted to use some resources, and we applied for a grant to develop a new service. And this is a service where we take care of young people who experience the first episode of psychosis, who are continuing to use the cannabis. So we've not been able to do anything in preventing the onset of the illness, but we want to try and modify what can have an impact on their clinical outcome. And this little cartoon has actually been thought and designed by my patients, because this is what they see is their journey when they start with a brain full of cannabis and where they want to be when the cannabis has left their brain. They want to be able to do more exercise, perhaps get a girlfriend or a boyfriend, go back to music and go back to their studies. And so looking at what is the population of the people that come to this clinic, this is the early number of our service, 32 people referred. You can see pretty much all of them are using every day, and all of them are spending quite a significant proportion of the money, which come from benefits, from financial support, because they don't work on weekly basis, and they are all using skunk. So this is the team. We have a team in the cannabis clinic, psychological intervention, mostly based on well-established addiction tools like motivational interviewing and contingency management, and I'm happy to answer a question about this. And something slightly new, we are offering a harm reduction pharmacological replacement, which is actually a medicine made with cannabis. It's medicinal cannabis Sativex, which contain 2.7 milligrams of THC and 2.5 milligrams of CBD per puff, because it's an oral mucosal spray. And this is actually proving quite successful, and I'm again happy to answer to questions. They have a period where they have one-to-one sessions, and we take very detailed information on the level of cannabis dependence, on psychopathology, on cognition. We measure halfway and at the end when they have achieved their cannabis reduction or cessation goals. And also as a group, everybody who is referred to the clinic takes part to now, because of COVID, virtual peer group session, which happen every 2 weeks, where we do some psychoeducation, inviting a guest that starts the session talking about some of the science and some of what we know about cannabis and mental health, cannabis in general, its compounds, and also cannabis and psychosis. And then we have a chit chat all together, which is moderated by peer group, which are really people who have a lived experience both for psychosis and cannabis use, and they've made a change because they've stopped their cannabis use and now they're also well in relation to their psychosis. And this is some data if you're interested in understanding why we have decided to use Sativex as a replacement to facilitate harm reduction in some of those who are really struggling with reducing or stopping their cannabis use. So this is a diagram of our peer group, just to give you a visual example of how we are working with that. But because I mentioned also medicinal cannabis, I mentioned Sativex, I just want to conclude sharing with you what's also happening in relation to medicinal cannabis. So this is what's happening in California and what has been happening for a long time. But in UK, medicinal cannabis became legal. In fact, on the 1st of November of a year ago, we have just celebrated the anniversary. Where in California you can get cannabis for a medicine just claiming that is good for your knee pain or for your headache, or because it helps you with insomnia. In UK, the regulations are much more stringent. And in fact, although now cannabis is legal for medicinal reason, is really still underprescribed. And perhaps we can understand why. And I'm going to give you a very simple example of a medication we're all familiar, either because we're taking it as patients or perhaps because we have recommended it. So aspirin has been voted by the WHO the most prescribed medication in the world. We know very well what are its indications, but very importantly, we know its side effects. And for instance, we do know that there is a very important group, children and adolescents, that should never be given aspirin to control fever, because they can develop Ray's disease, which is a very severe encephalitis. And we know the dose to indicate if we are prescribing it as an anticoagulant or if we are giving it as an antipyretic, anti-inflammatory. And we know about interaction with our drug. So we all feel quite comfortable to take it or to prescribe it. What if we consider the similar table, but this time for cannabis? Look at the adverse effect. Yes, we do know about transient psychosis. We know that some people are more likely to develop psychotic disorder. And we think that this group is a group who is characterized by daily use, which is very relevant when you think about prescription, because usually when you give a prescriber medication, often you prescribe it for daily consumption. Of course, you should control, if you're using medicinal cannabis, the content and the amount of THC. But what about adolescents' use? Should we prescribe cannabis to everybody? We know it can also influence cognition, so we should take this into account. And we know now very clearly that it can affect driving ability. What about the indication? How confident we are, which are now the clinical indication where cannabis is really efficacious, and so the adverse effects are worthwhile taking a risk for. Pain, still controversial. I've actually belonged to a task force in Youth UK, which has just completed a review of all the published evidence for the effectiveness of THC preparation, THC and CBD preparation in pain, and this will be released soon. And there is still some ambivalence. Intractable nausea, indeed, there is very strong evidence for that, although I would not recommend it for somebody who's pregnant, as unfortunately is happening in the USA. Spasticity, yes, and Sativex is actually licensed and was initially licensed to treat spasticity in and pain in multiple sclerosis. Indeed, epilepsy, especially type of cannabis with high CBD, and particularly epilepsy in children, severe type of epilepsy like Duber syndrome. Inflammation, this is yet not clear. Schizophrenia and psychosis, there have been 3 trials, 2 negative and 1 positive, so the verdict is still out. And when we talk about schizophrenia and psychosis, we're really talking about CBD alone. What about medicinal cannabis dose? What dose should we give and what for? Exact active ingredient proportion. Are we just talking, when we talk about medicinal cannabis, about CBD and THC? Because in America, people are actually giving the cannabis plant, and we know that in the cannabis plant, there are hundreds of cannabinoids and terpenoids, some of which have got pharmacological properties. Do we know anything about interaction with other drugs? No. So perhaps this is why in UK, doctors have been extremely cautious in prescribing medicinal cannabis. What next? Well, indeed, we have not entirely answered the question of who are those who are more likely to develop a psychotic disorder. We have seen that asking how much they are using, what type, and perhaps even having good data that tell us for how long would allow us to identify in an easy and cheap way those more at risk. But still, genetics, I think, is going to play an important role, because not all users of skunk, not all daily users of skunk develop a psychotic disorder. So we still need to understand how genetics shapes individual susceptibility, and it's not by using general summary statistics for schizophrenia genes. So perhaps pathway analysis would be helpful. And we should not wait perhaps for this data to come along, but we should begin to consider what we can do for those people who we see in clinic with psychosis who are continuing to use cannabis, because we can have an impact on their outcome. So I would like to conclude, first of all, by thanking all the wonderful first episode psychosis patients who have taken part in these studies. These are long interviews and they've been very generous with their time, despite they were in the center actually of the first episode psychosis. And of course, all the controls, they've given their time as well. And very importantly, all the teams across Europe. And because we are in Spain, although virtually, I would really like to specifically thank Professor Arango and all the Spanish groups, because it's been really a pleasure to collaborate with them at each step of the project. And Professor Sir Robin Murray, who has inspired all the research in cannabis that I have done, and he continues to be one of the leading figures in the world in this field. And of course, my cannabis clinic team, who is a wonderful team and who is delivering an exceptionally and unique package of care. And of course, thank you to you all for your attention for what has been a quite long talk. Thank you very much.